Okay, we're starting chapter 11 today, Perek Yud Aleph. Vayhi kishmoa Yavin melech Hatzor. Vayishlach el Yovav melech Madon, ve'el melech Shimron, ve'el melech Achshaf, ve'el hamelachim asher mitzafon, bahar u'ba'arava, negev kinnerot u'bashvela, u'benafot dor miyam. This is what we call a classic run-on sentence in English. I think I mentioned in the past that one of the challenges in Tanakh in translation is that what we call a sentence, grammatical format of a sentence, does not match what in Tanakh is a pasuk. So you can have multiple psukim form one sentence, and you can have one pasuk that has multiple sentences in it. This is one of those very long sentences, but we'll break it down. Yavin melech Hatzor. Yavin is the name of the king of Hatzor. Hatzor is a city in the north. Hatzor is today a modern city in Israel as well, the city of Hatzor. It's very far north. It's north of the Kinneret. You can see it on the map that's both in the source page as well as here. If this is the Kinneret, Hatzor is north of it. Just in a modern map. Well, this is the modern map. This is another map that we've seen. Chatzor is all the way up here, like almost the northern tip of Israel. Not quite, but very far away. So when the king of Chatzor heard, his name is Yavin, what did he hear? So we'll see in the Mefarshim, what he heard was the story of the Israelite conquest of Yericho and of Ai and of the Brit with the Givonim, and now, which is what we read in the previous chapter, right? In Perek Yud, Adoni Tzedek Melech Mishleim heard Yehoshua Ta'ai, what he did to Ai, and the peace he made with the Givonim, and so he went to war. In Perek Yud Aleph, it's even more expansive, because what he heard was not just about Yericho and Ai, but now also about the defeat of all the kings in the south. So now it's a much bigger issue. Vayishlach el Yovav melech Madon. So now he wants to gather together a big army. So he sends word to Yovav, king of Madon, and Melech Shimron, king of Shimron, Melech Achshaf, and the king of Achshaf. These are all cities. These are all cities in the north of Israel. Essentially, in the Canaanite cities were essentially city-states. Each city had its own king, and its own wall, and its own army. And one of the things we've talked about was Yeshua's fear, and we'll see it in this parak most directly, Yeshua's fear of the uniting together of the Canaanite city kings into a unified army. That would be more problematic for Yeshua. Each individual city is less of an issue. It's a smaller army. It's defended by the walls. They'll deal with the walls, each one by itself. So he's here. You see the concern coming to fruition. Yavin, king of Chatzor, gathers together an alliance of kings and cities in the region, and he expands even that. So it's not enough that he has Chatzor and Madon and Shimron and Achshaf, which would match the four kings of the south, Yerushalayim, Lachish, Devir, etc. Here you have another four kings, Chatzor, Madon, Shimron, and Achshaf, the cities. But now he needs to expand it even more. Ve'el hamelachim asher mitzvon bahar u'ba'arava negev kinrot u'bashvela. Now he's reaching out to all the kings in the region, the kings in the north and in the hills and in the Arava south of the Kinneret, and in the lowlands and the coast and the Shvela, and all the way to Dor, on the coast of the sea. Haknanim mizrach u'miyam, the Canaanites in the east and the west. Ve'emori, ve'achiti, ve'aprizi, ve'evusi, bahar, and all the Canaanite factions in the mountains. Ve'achivi tachat Chirmon, all the way up to the Chivi who lived in the region of the Chirmon. What is the same Chirmon that it is today? Be'eretz HaMitzpah, in the land of Mitzpah. That's a really fascinating phrase. I'm not going to dwell on it for now, But the Hermon is described as land of Mitzpah. There are several places in Israel that are called the Mitzpah or Mitzpeh. There's Mitzpeh Yericho. There's a Mitzpeh in Eretz Binyamin. There's a few different places that are called Mitzpeh. Essentially, any hill region where you have a vantage point to be able to see would be called Mitzpeh or Mitzpah. Eretz HaMitzpah is the mountain region under the Hermon. What's the mountain region south of the Hermon? Is what in Tanakh is called the Bashan, or in modern Hebrew is called the Golan Heights. So now you've got a reach all the way up into the Golan Heights and into the Hermon. And that makes sense if you're talking about a last-ditch effort to to push back the Israelites. The king of Chatzor is not going to be satisfied with 4 cities. So let me do this map. He's not going to be satisfied with 4 cities. So he'll gather from Chatzor and from Shimron and from Achshaf. Unclear where Madon is, but all the way down to Dor, just down Chof Dor today. It's a beach in Israel. It's actually where they have a museum for the Tchelet discovery. All these cities in this region, plus all the Canaanites in the east and in the west, on the coast, and the Arava south of the Kinneret, and the Hermon, and the Eretz HaMitzpah of the Golan, this entire region. King of Chatzor has gathered together an alliance that essentially cuts across from Emek Beit to Nof Dor, everything north. Chatzor and Shimon and Tzor and Hermon, everything north. He is gathering a massive army, and where they're going to gather is in this place called Memarom. We'll see that momentarily. Back to the text. Vayetzu hem v'chol machanehem imam. They and all of their armies with them. So you have an alliance of massive alliance of armies. Am rav kachol asher al svatayam larav. An army so great like the sand of the sea in multitude. V'sus v'rechev rav ma'od. And on top of that, it's not just an army of soldiers, as we've had up until this point. Now, because he's engaged the Canaanites on the coast, now he's also engaged armies that have horses and chariots, and this is the first time we've seen that element as well. So now the feeling is Vayivadu kol hamlachim ha'ela. All these kings gathered together, Vayavo v'yachanu yachdav, and they encamped together al Memarom, this place called Memarom, the Lachem Israel, to fight against Israel in a final battle to defeat Yehoshua and to defeat the Israelites. What happens to this in this battle we'll see in a moment, but I want to just stop here to understand the significance of what we have, what is described here. So you start to look at the Mefarshim, in fact, deal with the question of why this unity or this effort to bring together all the kings as one. Rabbi describes it succinctly. He says, Shalach el, so some of them I have English translations for and some I didn't, so I'll just translate as I read. Shalach el Yovav melech Madon, he sent to Yovav, king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and Melachim Rabim, and to many kings. Besides those, Litkabetz Yachad, to gather together, to unity, to gather into one major force. Ulilachem im Israel, and to fight against Israel. Kedei shelo yiplu biyadam echad echad, because he understood that up until this point, the cities of the Canaanites were falling to Yehoshua one by one. Conquered Jericho, conquered Ai, made peace with Givon, went to war with Yerushalayim and Devir and Lachish and Ekron, etc. And he defeated them one by one on the battlefield. Now, says the king of Chatzor, we're going to bring everybody together. This great multitude, like the sands of the sea, an army to defeat Israel. And we'll talk about that phrase, in a moment. This is exactly what we said from the very beginning. There are two major strategic concern and tactical concerns that Yehoshua faces. One is the walls of the cities, the fortification of each city, and the need to draw the armies out of the fortification and the protection of the walls. And the other is the concern about the unity of the kings of Canaan. Yehoshua is racing against the clock. And here you see exactly that concern come to fruition. In the previous chapter, in chapter 10, we saw the emphasis on the need to keep the armies from retreating into the fortifications of their cities. And so as they're on the retreat, Yehoshua says to his army, don't let them go back to their cities, capture them quickly. Therefore, he had the Shemesh B'Kivadom. He wanted to make sure that the battle was won that day so that the armies would not retreat to the fortifications of the walls. That was an address to the first issue. And now we see the address to the second issue, which is the power and the potency of the Canaanite kings. If they were to unite, they would create this formidable force that for Yehoshua would be a challenge. Okay, observation. Yavin, king of Chatzor, is the linchpin to this battle. He is the main kind of instigator, if you will, or initiator of this alliance. Who is Yavin, king of Chatzor? Now, the truth is that Yavin, king of Chatzor, is not an unfamiliar name to us if we have studied further in history. In other words, if we've gone past Sefer Yehoshua, we encounter him again, it would seem, the beginning of Sefer Melachim, in the story of Devorah and Barak. That story begins in Shoftim Perek Daled, Vayasifu b'nei Yisrael asot hara b'nei Hashem ve'Ehud met, in the aftermath of Ehud, who was the shofet at the time. Vayimkerem Hashem biyad Yavin melech Canaan, and God sold them into the hands of Yavin, king of Canaan, Asher Malach b'Chatzor, who reigned in Chatzor. And he had a general, his name was Sisra, and the rest of the battle takes place, and he had 900 chariots. The rest of the battle takes place, is not our subject, that's in Shoftim Perek Daled. But it's fascinating that by the time we get to Shoftim, we're once again in Yavin, king of Chatzor. I just want to take one thing for 1 second. Apologies for. Sorry, I just have to do a technical. Come on, I'll go away. Okay. Sorry, I just want to. Okay. So let's go back to our story, or our text. So who is this Yavin? So understand that the story of Devorah and Barak is more than a century later. It's a significant amount of time has passed between Yehoshua and Barak. So if you look at the Mefarshim, they address this question in an interesting way. Malbim says, Ben Yavin Melech Chatzor, sorry, I dropped off the Yud. Gam Melech Chatzor Shaya Bimei Dvorah Yavin Shmo. It says the Malbim, there's a king in the days of Dvorah who's a king of Chatzor, is also named Yavin. It could be great-grandchild named after his great-grandfather, and you could have two kings by the same name. However, he says the Malbim, a suggestion, Kol Melech Chatzor B'Torah Yavin. Maybe that, like Paro of Egypt, was a title, not a name. The title of the king of Chatzor is Yavin. Klamar Tiebo Bina Lasot Mishpat. Like he has extra Bina, extra wisdom to lead or to do just judgment or to lead in battle, whatever the case may be. It could be that it's a reference to a a malchus called Yavin. There's a hint to that a little bit in that verse in Shoftim, because in Shoftim he's called Yavin Melech Knan, Asher Malach B'Chatzor. He sort of has a broader title of Yavin, king of Knan, whose seat of his malchus is in Chatzor. So it's a little bit of an interesting a twist. Here is called Yavin, king of Chatzor, and there is called Yavin Melech Knan, who reigned in Chatzor. But in all cases, it could be the same individual. But that introduces us also to this other phrase, which I think is equally significant, namely that v'yatzu hem b'chol machnehem imam am rav kachol asher asvat hayam larov v'sus v'rechav rachmod. So first of all, the horse and chariots are very interesting because it's the first time we'll encounter horses and chariots in the parallel, not the parallel story, but in the parallel story of Yavin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Chatzor. That is the first time Israel will face chariots in Sefer Shoftim. And he has 900 chariots in this region of Emek Israel, and that's how Yavin, king of Chatzor, or Sisra, this general, ruled over them. So the presence of chariots creates a particularly important and significant escalation in the challenge that Yehoshua faces. Namely, not only does he have to deal with a large army, larger than he's encountered before, but he also has to deal with the technology that outguns him, because he doesn't have horses and chariots, all he has is soldiers. And soldiers against horses and chariots are at a significant disadvantage. And so this army that is gathered together has horses and chariots, and it has Amrav Kachol Asher Asvataya. Just an aside observation that today I just want to deal with some language issues. We'll deal with the much bigger, broader questions in the next year. But this phrase Amrav Kachol Asher Asvatayam is also an interesting phrase, where this notion of a great multitude, like the sand of the sea, is a phrase that is used to describe the size of the army of our enemy. That is also not an uncommon phrase. This is the first time it's used in this context, but in Sefer Shoftim we'll see it again, not in that story with Sisra, but later in the story with Gidon. And there we find a combined army, again a combined army, just like by Yavin here. There's a combined army of Yavin and Madon and Achshaf and the kings of the north and the kings of the Golan. But in the context of Shofar, Midian, Amalek, and Bnei Kedem. Kedem are nomadic tribes from the east. Midian, Amalek, Noflim be'emek, they fell in the valley. They attacked in the valley. Ka'arbelarov, like a plague of locusts. That's how many they were. And Ligmalehem and Mispar, and they didn't have chariots, but they had camels without number. Kachol sha'asvat hayam larov, like the sand of the sea in numbers, right? To describe an army in that way with great numbers and outnumbering us, certainly in terms of the reference here. You have it again in Shmuel Aleph, Perek Yud Gimel. These references, these sources are all on the source page. I'm just pulling them up here because I like to see them in the as close to a Tanakh online as you can get. But they're all in the source page. I put all of these references in the source page. You have them here. In Shmuel Aleph, Perek Yud Gimel, which is the Battle of Michmas, Shaul faces the Plishtim, and there again, and Shaul's army is outgunned and outnumbered. Uflishtim ne'esfu lilachem im Yisrael. The Plishtim gathered to fight against Israel. 30,000 rechev v'sheshet alafim parashim. 30,000 chariots. That's already. Devorah faced, and Barak faced 900 chariots, and we have the whole story of that. Right here we have they have 30,000 chariots. Va'am kachol asher asvat hayam larov. And soldiers like them, a multitude like the sands of the sea. And they came and they camped in Michmas, and that was a different battle. So the notion, the phrase, the phrase that is first used here as a threat against Israel, and it is subsequently borrowed in the story of Devorah, in the story of Gidon, and in the story of the battle of Michmas against the Plishtim. On the other hand, the phrase is not unfamiliar to us, but not from the perspective of a threat, but actually from the perspective of a blessing. Who in Tanakh is first described as having a size equal to the sand of the sea?
Avram.
Avram. And that's really the beauty of it, is that Abraham is given that's exactly the bracha that's given to Abraham. And it's given to Abraham. We see it in several places. In Bereshit Chapet, we see it immediately after the Akedah event. Vayikra malach Hashem al Avram shenit min hashamayim. The malach calls out to Abraham after the Akedah and says to him, Nishbati enu Hashem ki yan asher asita et hadavar hazeh v'lo chasachta et bincha et yichidecha, because you did this and because you did not withhold your son, your only son, your one son. So because you did not withhold your one son, the blessing, measure for measure, is to transform that one child into kivarecha barechacha, I will bless you, v'harba arbe tzaracha, I will multiply that seed. So you have one child, you didn't hold him back from me, so I will bless him, and from him will be born a multitude, and a sizable generations later, harba arbe tzaracha, like the stars of the sky, which already we saw in the story of Abraham. God says to Abraham, go outside, look up to the heavens. Can you count the stars? But here he adds the metaphor, v'kachol asher svatayam, like the sand of the sea. And adds v'yirash v'chad sharevav, and they will inherit, they will conquer the lands of their enemies. That's already an additional element. Yaakov repeats that phrase. Yaakov, when he returns from the house of Lavan and he's challenged to face Esav for the first time, says he offers a prayer, and in his prayer he says, "Atzileni na miyad achim miyad Esav, save me from the hands of Esav. Ki yarei anochi oto pen yavo v'ikani ema banim." I'm afraid that he's going to come and conquer. Yata Marta, you God said, "Hetiv etiv imach," I will make it good for you. I will deal with you kindly. Like the sands of the sea, they cannot be counted. So on the one hand, the notion of being blessed with a army or with a size of the people, the size of the sand of the sea, is a blessing given to Abraham, is a blessing repeated to Yaakov, and is a reflection of what Israel is promised. Interestingly, in our story, it's not Israel who comes with an army or with a people the size of, like the sand of the sea, but rather the unified armies of our enemies, right? The Canaanites, Yavin, and Yovav, and king of Madon, and king of Shimon, and king of Achshaph, and all the kings of the north, and all the kings of the Arava, and all the kings of the area around the Kinneret, and south of the Kinneret, all the way up to the coast, and the kings in the Canaanites, and the kings in the east, and the kings in the west, and the Amorites, and the Hittites, and the Phrizites, all of them together, Amrav Kachol Asher Svatayim. Nation, people, an army as great as the sand of the sea. And that's the threat now that's going to face Yehoshua. This really is an existential threat. You take the numbers here, which are significantly larger than the army of Israel, and you take the horses and chariots, which means that we are technologically outmaneuvered and outgunned. This is now a significant threat. And so before we move to the battle, there's interjected here the next verse, which adds a spiritual element into Yehoshua's defense. Hashem el Yehoshua. God said to Yehoshua, Al tiram ipnehem. Don't be afraid of them. כי מחר כעת הזאת אנוכי נותן את כולם חללים לפני ישראל. Tomorrow at this time, they will all be delivered into Israel. And says in this pasuk, God says to Yehoshua, "Et susehem te'aker et markavotehem tisrof be'esh." Their chariots you will burn with fire; their horses you will hamstring, meaning cut the hamstring, which is essentially which is the where the idiomatic expression comes. Something is hamstring, meaning it's held back, which is a way of preventing a horse from being able to run or be able to participate in fighting, like leading a chariot. That's the command to Yehoshua. ויבוא יהושע וכל עם המלחמה עמו עליהם על מי מרום פתאום ויפלו בהם. So Yehoshua and his army, v'chol am hamilchama, were with him, come to the armies of the Canaanites in the area of Mei Marom. Mei Marom is where the army of Yavin was gathering. And Vayachanu, right, in Pasuk Hey, Vayivadu kol melchim ele v'yavo vayachanu yachdav el Mei Marom. They'd gathered together in Mei Marom to fight against Israel, but it takes time to gather the armies of 10 different armies of different cities and different command structures under one leadership and one command. So they gathered together. In the meantime, Yehoshua has inside information. Right? Yehoshua is told in advance that this is happening. Yehoshua has a very good spy, satellite in Shemaim, namely the Rabbanu Shalom. And Hashem says to Yehoshua, this is what's going on. ויבוא יהושע וכל עם המלחמה עמו עליהם על מי מרום פתאום. So Yehoshua launches a surprise attack. He takes the army of Israel and he quietly maneuvers them north. Remember, the camp is in Gilgal, which is Yericho, which is opposite the Jordan, the northern tip of the Dead Sea. So he's got to go from the Dead Sea, right? Gilgal is down here. He's got to take the army all the way up north through the area of the Shomron up to Mei Marom, which is more or less, I don't know if it's on this map, but more or less in this area. We'll see it in a moment. And he does so in such a way that he attacks Pitom suddenly. And that's the key to Yeshua's success, is that his attack is a surprise attack against the Canaanites. He basically launches a preemptive strike before they're able to gather themselves together. When they're still counting, when the tanks are still in their, when the missiles are still in the silos, they haven't gathered the horses together. Vayiplu b'hem, and they fell upon them. Vayitnem Hashem biyad Yisrael. God gave them into the hands of Israel. Vayakum, and he smote them. And not just to defeat them in Mei Marom, but now once they're defeated, so then they turn and run. Vayirdefum, and he chases them. Where does he chase them? Ad Tzidon Rabbah, all the way up to Tzidon, which is in Lebanon. The Ad Misrafot Maim, which is another place that's unclear where it is, but we'll see in various options. The Ad Bik'at Mitzpeh Mizracha, and all the way up to the Golan. Meaning he chases these armies north and scatters them. Vayakum ad bilti shilhem savit. So until these armies are defeated and decimated. Vayaz lem Yeshua kasher marlo Hashem. And then Yeshua does exactly what God had commanded him, which is that Susehem iker et markavotahem sarat be'esh. The horses he hamstrung and burnt the chariots with fire. We'll see why that was important in a second. Vayashav Yehoshua ba'etahi, and then Yehoshua goes back to clean up a little bit. Vayilkod et Chatzor vet malkai kabacharev, to conquer Chatzor, to smite its king by the sword, which is again further evidence that it's not the same Yavin Melech Chatzor, because otherwise that would be complicated, considering the fact that Yehoshua kills the king of Chatzor here. Ki Chatzor lefanimi rosh kol ha'mamlecha ha'ela. And there again, you have that emphasis. Chatzor was the leading city amongst all of these cities. If you conquer Chatzor, symbolically, you've really conquered the head of the, to borrow a modern term, the head of the snake. And that's exactly what he does. He burns Chatzor to the ground. And then he literally city by city he conquers, and he destroys them, as he was commanded by God. The only city he burnt was Chatzor, unnecessary to burn all the other cities. They were entitled to the spoils of the war. We talked about that back in the story of Yericho. He destroyed the army, destroyed the Canaanite nations that were there. As he was commanded, Kasher tziva Hashem et Moshe avdo, ken tziva Moshe et Yehoshua, v'chein asa Yehoshua le'isir davar mikol asher tziva Hashem et Moshe. Yehoshua did exactly as Moshe had commanded and as God had commanded Moshe. The rest of this parak we'll look at another time. Why is it necessary twice it emphasizes that in this defeat of the Canaanite army, Yehoshua God instructs him to hamstring the horses and burn the chariots. Once in Pasuk Vav, and then it again repeats it in Pasuk Chet. It says in Pasuk Tet, it says that's what he did. Why is that necessary? So there are two issues here, and they're discussed in the Mefarshim. Rabbi says the following: This command, which is really quite a little bit, would seem to be unnecessary. Right? You conquer all these horses and chariots, you might as well take advantage of that opportunity. And even the scale technologically, God says no. Israel should not take them. Lest they take them and rely on them in the matter of wars. So they shouldn't say, based on the pasuk in Devarim, that this defeat, that this war was defeated by the strength of their own hands. So that their trust should always be in God. And so they will know that God is the one who defeats these enemies and not them. We have a similar sentiment in the Abarbanel with one additional twist. Because as a kind of a reference or an indication that Yavin introduced into the battles of Canaan an element we haven't seen before, namely horses and chariots. This is the first time. And those horses and chariots became the symbol of the strength of the enemy. And with maybe Yavin thought that it was because the other nations, the other kings that were defeated by Israel didn't have horses and chariots. We have horses and chariots. We're going to like the Egyptians. We're going to defeat Israel. Because they thought that their security, their strength was in the strength of their horses and chariots. Al tira mipnehem. That's why God had to say to Yehoshua, don't be afraid. Come back to that phrase, don't be afraid. It's very important for us. I will give them all into your hands. And that's why God instructed Yehoshua to hamstring the horses. As a kind of a symbol against the Canaanites, as a way of saying, you put your strength in these horses, we're going to defeat those horses. And that's how you would do it, by hamstringing the horses. That's one interpretation. Adds an element of a kind of a tit for tat. But besides that, says the Barbanel, like the Rabbi before, so that Israel shouldn't take these horses and chariots and use them, and that they shouldn't want to rely on them. And therefore, because God, victory belongs to God. And that's really the introduction to a very important issue, which is what I entitled as the topic of the shir, the military strategy and divine hand in Yeshua's conquest, and the balance between them, which is such an extraordinary issue. And here, both the Rabbi and the Abarbanel says the instruction to Yehoshua to hamstring the horses, not to take them, not to use them to even the score or even the power balance between them and the Canaanites, which is so tempting. You won this victory with such extraordinary circumstances because you happen to have inside information God shared with you that they were gathering, and so you were able to launch a surprise attack and be able to reach them before they could organize themselves. And so pitom, you fell on them suddenly. Pitom, you can't rely on that every day. So here you have an opportunity to take horses and chariots, which you, Israel, don't have. You could even the score, says the Abarbanel, says the Rabbi, all the Mefarshim. No, God says you cannot even the score. It forces Israel into a kind of dependence on God beyond just the strength of their army. And that's really a very important piece of the way the Torah presents the concept of reliance on God in the face of battle. Take a look at this pasuk with which the story began, pasuk Vav. God says to Yehoshua, before he says to him the instructions about the horses, he says, "V'yomer Hashem el Yehoshua, al tira mipneh." Don't be afraid of them. Don't fear them. By tomorrow they will be in your hands, and then you will deal with the horses. Don't think just because they have a technological edge, meaning the horses and chariots, that you are outgunned and outmaneuvered. No, I will ensure that you are victorious. It's fascinating. The Mefarshim link this to a pasuk in Devarim, which in itself is a fascinating pasuk. Let's use this one. Pasuk says, "Ki tetzei lemilchama," in the beginning of paragraph of Dvarim, "Ki tetzei lemilchama alevecha." If you go to war, when you go to war against your enemies, "V'ra'ita sus v'rechev am rav mimecha," and you will see an army with horses and chariots greater in number than thee, right? A large army and a large technology of horses and chariots. Lo tiramehem, you shall not be afraid of them. Because God is with you. God took you out of Egypt. And that's precisely the circumstances that the Navi is describing Yehoshua. You have horses and chariots and a large army, much larger, all the united forces of Canaan, larger than Israel. And God says to Yehoshua, don't be afraid. There's a fascinating context here. There are many Mefarshim who suggest that this notion, lo tiramehem, not to be afraid, is actually a biblical mitzvah not to be afraid when we go into war against our enemies. And the first time I encountered this personally, I'll share with you a personal story. Last November 2023, I had the schus of coming to Israel right after the October 7th war began, and it was a rabbinic mission. And we had a kind of an evening with one of the army units that was heading into Gaza. There was before they were going in, Yosef Tzvi actually to organize like a barbecue evening with them, chizuk for the Chayal. And I even videoed it. I have this little video clip. I didn't bring it to you now, but where Rimon addressed the Chayalim, and he said to them, there's a mitzvah in the Torah when you go to war against your enemies not to be afraid. Lo tiramehem. And so when they started to sing Kol Olam Kulo and Lo Lefached Klal, etc., he says to them, when you sing the song, you have to have in mind that you're fulfilling the Mukhana Mezum, and you have in mind to fulfill the mitzvah, not to be afraid of our enemies. It's a fascinating perspective. That's exactly what he's saying to them. Don't be afraid, because I am with you, even though you're outnumbered, and you're outgunned, says the God to Yehoshua, Al tinam mipnehem. They're all going to be yours. And so by informing Yehoshua and enabling Yehoshua to take advantage of the element of surprise in his attack of the north, God enables Yehoshua to defeat this enemy. And that is the key to understanding one of the big issues that we're going to look at in the remaining part of the shir, which is the balance between the army's work, the human effort of Yehoshua and his army, versus the divine providence and the divine protection that God says to him, I will protect you, I will guide you. I will give them into your hands. What does that mean? How much effort, right? If God says to them, I will give them into your hands, if I will protect you, then and I will enable you to be victorious, just to put it into simple terms, but then why does Yehoshua have to launch a surprise attack? If God promises Yehoshua victory, so he promised Yehoshua victory. So why does he have to launch a surprise attack? And by the way, the element of surprise Yehoshua uses in both Perek Yud and Perek Yud Aleph. Put on this chart a comparison of these two psukim. Sorry for the spacing, didn't work out here. This is in chapter 10. God says to Yehoshua again in the previous chapter, Al tiramehem, don't be afraid of them, because I will give them into your hands. Ki biyadcha nitatim. The next verse, Yehoshua takes his army and he moves from Yericho to Givon, and he does so all night long so that he can launch a surprise attack against his enemies. It's exactly the same element here. In Perek Yud Aleph, it's almost the same language. God says to Yehoshua, Al tiram mipnehem, don't be afraid of them. I will give them into your hands. Anochi noten et kolam chalalim mipnei Yisrael. So Yehoshua turns and he takes his army and he climbs all the way up to the north and he attacks Me'marom and he attacks Pitom. Suddenly, the element of surprise.
Last parasha, Moshe is asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu to nominate a person asher yitzeh v'yavo lifnehem.
Right.
And he does exactly what Moshe was asking it to type of a leader.
I understand. I'm asking a much more theological, a philosophical and theological question. What is the balance between this statement God says to Moshe? He made the same statement to Moshe. You have exactly the same circumstance by Moshe Rabbeinu. I'll show it to you in a moment. God says to him, I will give the enemy into your hand. I promise you victory. And then the tactics begin and the element of surprise and the army gathered together, etc. Right? That's exactly the question. What is the balance between when God says, I promise you victory, and then you have to go out and fight the battle and employ tactics and strategy, etc. When God says to you, I will enable you to defeat your enemy. Is there a lack of faith or a lack of trust in the human effort of the surprise attack or the whatever the tactics are, if God says to you, I promise you the victory. This is an enormous theological question. It's not just about on how an army operates. It's about how the kings of Israel operate. The notion, for example, in Chumash, that when the Torah says, let me just see if I can find it quickly. When the Torah's mandate of building an army, God says to you in the Torah, it says there's a mitzvah to appoint a king. Appointing a king is essentially a mitzvah of appointing an army. And one of the limitations on the army or on the king is the Torah limits the technological advance or power that an army of Israel is allowed to have by saying you can't have too many horses and not to become dependent upon Egypt, which was the source of horses in the ancient world from an economic perspective, right? So you don't want to be dependent upon the economy of Egypt. So God says you can't have too many horses, but if you can't have too many horses, that means that you can't have an army of horses and chariots, and you're limiting the technological advance. Imagine, again, I want to be careful of how we frame this, but imagine saying today, Navi came along and said, an army of Israel can have soldiers, but it can't have tanks and it can't have F-15s, right? That would be essentially the same equivalent. I think it would pose a very significant theological challenge for us. Go into battle knowing that you are on the disadvantage, and yet you're relying on God.
They actually listened to the Americans and ended up with a similar mess.
Whatever. I'm not judging. I'm just the question is the theological question, and it's a valid theological question. And we're going to look at how ways in which to address that question. But I'll give you two examples, even by Moshe Rabbeinu, where God says to Moshe, where Moshe is leading Bnei Yisrael through the lands of Moab and Edom, and he comes to the land of Sichon, and he asks for permission to walk through. This is in Parshat Chukat. And Sichon wouldn't let Israel through. So Sichon gathered all the people together, and they came to fight a war with Israel. And a war began. And Israel defeated the enemy by the sword. And once they were defeated, he took his land. Now, what miraculous intervention, divine moment, staff, miracles, hailstones from the sky. What miracle took place here to enable Israel to defeat their enemies? None. It just says that Israel defeated their enemies. One could argue, that there was no divine hand in this victory. Israel was victorious. However, immediately upon the defeat of Sichon, next paragraph, again, continuing along the same lines, Israel continues through, Moshe sent spies to Yazer. They conquered the city of Yazer. Moshe is leading an army. They're conquering, they're fighting, right? There's no hand, there doesn't seem to be a hand of God in any of this, right? If you want to read it that way. And then they turn to the Bashan. And they're faced with another battle, this time by Og. And here, look what God says to Moshe. This is by Moshe Rabbeinu. Vayomer Hashem Moshe, Al tira'oto, don't be afraid of him. Ki biyadcha natati, whoops, sorry about that. Ki biyadcha natati oto ve'et kol amo ve'et arzo. Because I will give them into your hands. Ve'asita lo kasher asita l'sichon melachem moria sheyeshem b'cheshbon. And you will do to him what you did to Sichon. Meaning, in hindsight, the retrospective is that their defeat of Sichon was also Moshe led the battle, the people fought the battle, but there was God's protection behind the scenes. And behind the scenes becomes the critical factor here. In other words, where we're at in the end of the 40 years is a moment in which Moshe begins to fight the battles of Canaan, but there's no hail from the sky, there's no arba, there's no makat choshech, there's no kriyat yamsuf, there's no miracles, there's no staff, there's no water, there's no be'er, there's no miracles. There's just Moshe and the army of Israel fighting the defeat of Sichon and then the defeat of Og. And God says to him, I'm with you. And that's precisely what he says to Yehoshua. I'm with you. That doesn't mean that Yehoshua shouldn't take an army and shouldn't lead an army with tactics, with strategy, fall upon the enemy pitom, right? Tactics and strategy and human effort to the maximum extent possible is required. But so is a faith in God ultimately, because no battle and no victory is ever guaranteed. And so the balance between the leadership, the military strategy that Yehoshua has to employ, that Moshe Rabbeinu has to employ, without reliance on miracles. There's not a reference to a miracle in this whole chapter. There's no sun standing still, as we had in the previous chapter. There's no trumpet being blown and the walls come down like we have at Jericho. There's just Yehoshua and his army and the element of surprise. And then they have to fight. And then God says, Veitnem Hashem b'yad Yisrael, I'll give them into your hands. And that's the key to understanding this message, this notion that this God is kind of retreating to a behind-the-scenes kind of assistance, where ultimately is Yehoshua, like Moshe at the end of his life. Right? It's Yehoshua and the army of Israel that has to lead the strategy, that has to lead the tactics, that has to lead the army, and then rely ultimately on a kind of hidden hand of God behind the scenes. That's the key to understanding Sefer Yehoshua. To wean them off the miracles of the staff and the sea splitting and the walls falling and the trumpets blowing. That's how the story begins. The Malach who comes to Yehoshua at Jericho and says, I'm here for you. They're in a different place. They're going to have to fight this battle on their own. They're going to have to fight this battle with their army. And in the end, they're able to take the spoils of war. We talked about the spoils of war way back in our study of the Battle of Jericho, where they weren't allowed to take spoils because the Malach fought the battle and brought the walls down. Here, Israel fights the battles, and therefore, Bazazulem b'nei Israel, they could take the spoils. But at the same time, they have to recognize the hand of God in this battle. Lo tira. That's a very difficult challenge. That's the challenge. That's the challenge, the balance between self-reliance and the arrogance of kochi v'otzim yadi, it's my hand, it's my victory, I was successful, and pat yourself on the back, versus saying Hallel, or singing Shira, or recognizing the hand of God even in those moments and in those victories. What it took Bnei Yisrael in the Midbar 40 years to figure out, right? They had to go through the Midbar. They started with the Makot Mitzrayim and Kriyat Yamsuf and the Man and the Slav and the Ananei Kavod and the well and the rock for water. By the time they get to the land of Israel, they're eating of the produce of the land, and the miracles are diminished to the point of natural miracles, what we call hashgacha, divine providence or protection, but very much behind the scenes. That transformation, that is the maturing process of a people. That's what God says to Yehoshua, to Moshe in Parak Aleph of Devarim, Alei Reish, it's time to go up and conquer. You, the army, has to take that effort. and conquer. That's the partnership. That partnership is the subject of Tanakh. I can't state this strongly enough. The primary theme throughout almost all of Tanakh is the balance between human effort and divine providence, between what we do and the efforts we have to lead, to create, to be a people, but then to be loyal to the laws and limitations of the Torah. Sometimes they are at odds with each other, like the prohibition against too many horses, or too many political marriages and alliances, right? There are limitations on the power of the king. There's a balance to be struck, but that's exactly these two levels of operation, the human effort and the divine operation behind the scenes. That's the primary message of Tanakh, that what we do to create a people and a land and a nation can't be at the expense of recognizing that it is God who enables us to do so. This goes all the way back to the beginning of Chumash, right? The Brit Ben Abtarim, when God says to Bnei Israel, to Abraham, your children will be slaves in a foreign land. They'll be enslaved by this nation called this nation for 400 years. And when they leave, I will hold the nation accountable. Why? Because what we do and human effort and human initiative is independent of God's calculation for the world. And so Mitzrayim, who enslaved us, is accountable because they enslaved us and they acted evilly. Even if it was part of God's plan, they are completely separate issues. Take Mechiret Yosef, the sale of Yosef. Right? Yosef, the brothers sell Yosef into slavery. Was that part of God's plan? Yes. Yosef says it. Right? You didn't send me here. God sent me here to be a source of sustenance for all of you. Does that absolve the brothers of the crime of selling their brother into slavery? Not at all. That's one of the most difficult theological questions to address, but it's the foundation of all of Tanakh. God's operation, God's messaging behind the scenes is God's domain. And our effort has to be to do what we need to do, to be loyal, to behave in a manner in which we build the nation that God wants us to build and create, and then at the same time to be loyal to the laws that the Torah creates for us. But to see these two levels of operation, God's hand and human effort, operating constantly in parallel to each other, but not to rely on it to the point, meaning not to withdraw our own effort and to withdraw our own hand and say, God promised he will protect us, he will protect us. Like Yaakov Avinu, when he comes to face Esav. Here he has a promise. God says to him, right? Because you promised that I will be with you and that your children will be like the seed of the sea. If I am destroyed, there's nothing to come of your promise, says Yaakov to God. And at the same time, he prepares an army, and he splits his army into two camps, and he prepares a gift of appeasement for Esav. Right? The notion that we operate on these two planes, God's plane and our plane, is the foundational challenge and message of all of Tanakh. And that's what you have here in Yehoshua. God says to Yehoshua, I will give them into your hands. Don't be afraid. But that requires of Yehoshua, what, to walk into battle without any preparation, without any tactics, and rely on God? No. It requires of Yehoshua to take his army, to climb the hills all the way up to the north, to attack in advance in the middle of the night. There's an element of surprise, to do everything that they can within the human effort to be victorious. And then when it's done, to sing Shira to God. That song is coming. It's going to be in Perek Yud, the list of all the kings that are victorious. That's Yeshua's song of victory. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. So that's the mess. I'm going to stop sharing actually from here. That's the message of the first, the last, if you will, major battle that Yeshua campaigns. The big difference between this campaign and Perek Yud and the previous one is that even in the previous one, as much as Yeshua had and his army had to take all the effort to go and to run and to chase and to fight, you have that reference to the sun standing still, whatever that meant, Shemesh b'Kivondo, some miraculous element there. Here you don't have any of that. Here you just literally have Yeshua and his army in the middle of the night and will launch a surprise attack. And yet God says to him, don't be afraid. That's the balance. So that's our introduction to this parak. Next week, Bezrat Hashem. No class next week. Next week I'm traveling. No class next week. So there's no class on the 29th. The week after, which will be the August 5th, I believe, we're going to take this one step further because I want to trace this element of the nature of God's intervention, the nature of God's miracles, and the notion that the greater the openness of the miracle, the less significant or the weaker the state of the Jewish people is, counterintuitively. I want to talk about that in the context of Tanakh as a whole and Sefer Yehoshua in particular. So what I call the weaning off of miracles as a foundational value of Tanakh.
Rabbi Shulman,
Yes, sir.
you have the same balance in personal life too. To what extent do you have to do hishtadlut?
No question.
With regard to shidduch or business or etc., etc.
100%. It applies to everything, but it's the major theme of all of Tanakh, and so we have to address it seriously. Yeah, for sure. Yosef D. Robinson has a hand raised. Okay.
Right. So, when do you actually plan on moving from St. Louis to Yerushalayim?
We are en route. So we begin our journey by driving to New York next week, which is why I won't be able to teach next Tuesday. We'll be in New York for a week. I fly to Israel August 6th and I land August 7th.
Hatzlacha Rabbah.
Thank you very much. So,
Rabbi.
thank you very much. Appreciate
Thank you
that.
very much.
Hopefully it won't disrupt our schedule too much.
That's my cue to
If you
leave.
get to
All the
Shiloh,
best,
you have to-
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much. Safe trip.
You too.
And
With
Song
Mazel,
Hatzlacha.
Thank you very much.
all the best with Mazel.
Thank you.